You probably have watched a video or read an article by now about DeepSeek, which is China's response to ChatGPT and other AI chat bots, OpenAI. And you probably have read some of the articles or watched some videos about how impressive it is, and it is. And I want to talk about something that I find really interesting, because this is one more example of what happens when China is constrained. And so the United States policy to constrain or contain China, in my mind, has failed. And I want to talk about it because this has been going on for a long time. 30 years now, at least. I think in the 80s, China was opening up and the United States was interested in working with China. And the idea behind kind of the neocons, the liberal thought was, if China gains economic prosperity through trade with the United States and through trade with the Western world, so to say, they will demand liberalization of other aspects of society, specifically politics. And they were hoping that over time they would demand a democracy. And then when the democracy was formed, the United States, much like with other democracies around the world, could swoop in and shape it in their image with their control. And that didn't happen. So when China was opening up, a lot of businesses flooded China, opened up factories and said, great, cheap labor, great opportunity for us to produce a lot of goods. And when more money comes into the economy, more liberalization will happen. And then as time goes on, we can shape that the way we want to, right? So that China would become another puppet state like Japan or the UK or any other country that the United States dominates through all the means that it has to put pressure on a country. And things were going okay at the beginning. I think as the economy liberalized and opened up and more people had opportunity, there was more demand for more access to information and more liberalization of the politics. But China said, no. We're in charge. We aren't going to have another century of humiliation like we had before, where the Western powers carved up all of China and used it for their own gain. So the government said, yeah, we need prosperity because it'll help us pull people out of the poverty that they were in. But we don't need to liberalize our government to the point where it falls apart. So this was kind of the two clashing ideas and why China is an enemy and not a friend. These ideas were clashing. China wanted its own form of government and its own independence and its own ability to make decisions about its own country. And the United States wanted to turn it into a vassal state like it did with Japan or any other place that it exerts its influence. And so when it became clear that China wasn't going to roll over and it wasn't going to let its media become infected with Western propaganda, and it wasn't going to allow its ruling party to fall to corruption and greed that would eventually corrode the economy and corrode the political system, the United States specifically said, we are creating a monster that needs to be contained. And I think this was probably in the 2000s, about 20 so years from the 80s to early 2000s. I think there was a lot of hope in Washington that things would change in China for what they considered the better, right? And in a direction in which they could control China. And when it didn't happen, and China was getting richer, and China was exerting more influence and more power around the world, they realized, we created a monster. And again, I'm not saying the United States created it. China did all this on their own, right? China pulled itself out of poverty. But the thought in Washington was, we are helping China in order to influence China, in order to create a very powerful vassal state, and that didn't happen. And so China had its own way of doing things, as it always has, and China continued to follow their plan of development. And when the United States realized that China's plan of development, which they were following, didn't align with the Western ideology or the Western way of doing things, that's when they started to switch the narrative a lot more. And I'd say this was in the early 2000s, that China was kind of a country that needed to be contained. And you can see by how much trade China was doing around the world why the United States started to essentially fear China. Because if you can't control it, then China is very powerful. And then China's a rival. So today, another 20 years has passed, basically, and China is the biggest rival of the United States, which is why they're pushing hard to contain China, but they failed. In that 20 years, basically, when they switched the mentality to, we need to stop China from rising, it was already too late. They had already failed. And we can see this, again, I'm talking about DeepSeek. We can see this by the way that the United States implemented bans and tariffs and excluded China from kind of the international community. And every time that they did this, because the containment strategy didn't work, every time that they tried to contain China, it actually made China stronger. So when we look back throughout history, China was barred from the International Space Station because the Americans and the other Western powers said that we can't trust the Chinese. They might steal technology. So what did China do? Built its own space station. Now, the ISS, the International Space Station, is basically being decommissioned, and the only real space station left is the Chinese one. And so now China is in a position of strength when the United States tried to bar them and keep them weak. Another good example of spaceflight is the GPS. So the United States barred China from using the GPS system. And so what they did was built the Beidou system, which is actually better than GPS. It's actually more accurate. And so that's just two examples of when they tried to contain China and it backfired, right? There's many examples going back to DeepSeek and going back to AI chips or semiconductors. About a couple years back, there was the whole chip war, which the United States has stopped talking about because they lost. But I remember, 2-3 years ago, everybody was talking about this chip war. Oh, the United States is barring China from buying chips because they wanted to stop China's AI development. They wanted to stop China's technological development. And what happened? Well, in that 3 or 4 years, China developed its own chips, completely homegrown, which no other country has ever done by themselves without any input from another country, which is unheard of because even the United States, although they might be able to produce it in the United States, they still require a lot of outside input, specifically from Taiwan, for their chip making. So if the United States wanted to produce chips on at scale to where they could put them in all the iPhones and all the computers and all the all the gadgets that use these chips, it would be very hard for the United States to do that in the United States without any other input from other countries. Because they barred China from buying the chips from Taiwan, China was forced to make these chips themselves. And that's what they did. So now China has the ability to scale up their production, and they don't need Taiwan. They don't need Japan. They don't need the United States for any of their parts or any of their software now because they were forced to do it on their own. And this is kind of why I think the United States containment policy has failed, because every single step of the way, every time they barred China from, the international community, whether it was trade or technology or some other aspect in which they were trying to keep China from rising, China just did it at home. And now they're stronger because they don't rely on it. Like, imagine all of the militaries around the world that are relying on the GPS system that is controlled by the United States. If the United States went to war with a country, they can shut that off. And if you can't use that GPS, it might be more difficult to conduct your military affairs. Whereas China, there's no threat of Beidou being shut off by the adversary, right? There's no way that the United States can just shut it off. Whereas if they still relied on GPS, if a conflict was to break out in Taiwan, say, or somewhere else, and the United States shut off China's access to GPS, China would be in a much worse position. Now, they're not in that position. And so there are countless examples of technologies or trade pacts or some other form of development that the United States tried to bar China from, and they just did it at home. And I think this is the fundamental problem with the United States approach to its adversaries, because they've been trying to contain and control China for so long that they never thought that a better strategy would be dependence. If China was completely dependent on the United States, they would be less likely to produce their own form of technology. I mean, this is very, I guess you could look at the United States in Europe. Europe hasn't produced any bit of technology and, anything worthy of note in 40 years. I can't think of, and I'm being super honest right now, I can't think of one piece of technology that has been groundbreaking that has come from Europe or the UK in the past 20, 30 years. Like, when we really think about where technology is being developed, it's being developed in the United States and it's being developed in China. And that's pretty much... Now, there's examples, I'm sure, and some of you can put in the comments, of a piece of technology that was developed in Europe or in Africa or in the Middle East or in another part of the world. But when we think of consistent technological development, it's pretty much, at this stage, the United States and China. In the 80s, it was the United States, and it was Germany, and it was Japan, and a bit of Korea. But now it's pretty much just the United States and China. And the reason that it's those two is because China hasn't had any access to the US technology, at least not the cutting edge stuff. So Europe doesn't need to develop its own technology, at least that's kind of seems to be the way that they're going, which is foolish. But because the United States shares all of its invention with, its allies, then you don't really need to invent anything. So Europe is completely reliant on the United States, whereas China is only reliant on itself because it was forced to be reliant on itself, because it didn't have access to the technologies in the same way. And so I think this policy of trying to contain China has actually made China much more powerful. It can create chips now that it couldn't create 5 years ago. Why? Because they were forced to. If the United States continued to provide those chips and not create this, technology ban, then China would have never been forced to develop their own chips, because they would have just kept buying them like everybody else does, right? Think about Europe. If they're creating some new technology, some new computer or cell phone or something, and they need those chips, they just buy it from the United States. They buy it from Taiwan, which Taiwan is basically, a vassal state of the United States, right? So when the United States went down this path, it seemed so foolish, because if your enemy is completely dependent on you, right? Don't bar them from GPS. Continue to let them develop on your platform and give them discounts if they want to use it, right? Get them more hooked on your piece of technology to where they're so dependent that if it was shut off, there was no hope, right? Imagine if Europe was shut out of the GPS system. I think they have something called Galileo, but what is it and who uses it? Is it even good? Nobody knows what it is. It's a satellite system that's similar to GPS, but who's ever heard of it? I don't even know if that's the name of it, but they do have some system, right? So this desire to contain and control China has actually backfired and made China more powerful because they're less dependent on the rest of the world for its technological development. And because the United States has created such bad will throughout the world by bullying other nations when it comes to trade deals, or when it comes to controlling technology, or when it comes to, a myriad of other issues with its military and having military bases in different countries, those countries are now saying, well, maybe China will be a better partner. So again, this idea of how the United States has gone around the world treating other countries like China, like the Middle East, like lots of countries in Africa, it's essentially forced these countries to look for a better trading partner, to look for a partner that's going to provide them with technology. When we look to Africa, who's building railroads, right? Who's building high-speed trains? Who's building subway stations? Who's providing technology through Huawei, 5G networks, and Xiaomi bringing cheap cell phones and very good but like affordable cell phones, and Hire and a bunch of other companies that are providing actual real value in these nations, versus the United States, who comes to these countries and say we're going to cut off aid because we don't want to provide it. That's it. We think it's costing us too much, even though it's like 0.1% of the U.S. budget, and it's buying goodwill in those countries. Where do you think those countries are going to go? They're going to go to China, because that's the only other real international player that can provide some support and has been providing support. While Trump is in the office, attacking their allies, saying we're going to put tariffs on Canada and Mexico and possibly the UK and possibly Europe, China is inviting 50 leaders from Africa and saying, come work with us. We'll provide you with billions of dollars worth of infrastructure investment. We'll provide you with technology. Who do you think's going to win in that case? Do you think China's going to look like the good guy? The one that's actually helping? While the United States looks like the bad guy? The one that's attacking its own allies? Like, who wants to be an ally if you're going to be attacked? Like, it's madness right now. And I think that is the biggest problem with Washington, is they've lost focus on how you actually influence people and how you actually create goodwill and create allies and partners. And you do that by providing things. You do that by being a good partner. That when your ally or when your partner is in need, you go in and you help them. And sometimes you don't get anything in return. Sometimes you lose money. Sometimes it's aid. And it's just interesting, because I think Washington has lost the plot, which I think will be better in the long run. But it is interesting to look at it from a geopolitical standpoint, to try and figure out the strategies behind what's going on. And with the United States, it feels like the strategy is, specifically with Trump, is the world owes us, and if you don't pay, we're going to retreat. And retreating only helps China? Possibly Russia? Like, the mentality is so strange right now. that it's just so fascinating to me. And I think the philosophy in Washington has been wrong for a long time. Like I said, having forced China to be completely reliant on its own ability has actually made it stronger. So I don't know. What do you guys think? Rambling about this because it's been on my mind for a while, and it's very interesting what's going on and how Washington and Beijing are interacting with each other, but also interacting with the rest of the world. While one is demanding tribute, basically, the other one is offering aid. And, I think the one that's offering aid will have a better result in the long run than the one that's demanding tribute and withholding aid. It's interesting. It's going to be an interesting 4 years, and I think this will be a make or break time for both the United States, specifically the United States, but also China, because as each one vies for, trading partners and allies and technology, it'll be interesting how the rest of the world reacts. Because right now it seems like the world is turning against the United States. And usually when you turn away from something, you need to turn to something. And most countries, because they've been so reliant on the United States for so long, haven't built their own technology, haven't built their own way of doing things, and so they can't really stand on their own. So when they turn from the United States, the only one that has been standing on their own is China. So this will be an interesting 4 years. I think it'll be very difficult for the United States to recover after this, and I think it puts China in a position of, if they play it right, they could be in a much better position 4 years from now than they are now. Not that they're in a bad position currently, but just saying, when it comes to technology and it comes to international cooperation, they could be the future leaders, because the United States does not seem to want that position anymore, even if it brings them a lot of benefits. So let me know what you guys think. Again, rambling on about this. Leave a comment below. What do you think? Do you think that the United States policy of trying to contain China has actually backfired and made China more powerful? Or do you think China was always going to go down this path? Doesn't matter what the United States does. This is how China operates, and it is what it is. Leave a comment below and let me know.